Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. Today is March 25th, 2020, and there's no question that we are now in the middle of a hammering effect of two crises which are changing life on the planet dramatically, the coronavirus pandemic and the global financial disintegration. And I think this is where we have to start to take a look at where we are in terms of the spread of this pandemic. So, Helga, why don't you begin with that?
Well, I think it is clearly very quickly spinning out of control. And I think it's useful to look at the condition of several countries to really put quiet those idiots who still say that this is just a flu and not worse than an influenza, and people who say this is all a conspiracy. I mean, this is a real pandemic, and it does require the absolute unified cooperation of all countries in one effort to overcome it, because this is a pandemic. Now, and a pandemic means it is raving across the globe. Yesterday, Prime Minister Modi in India shut down the whole country for 20 days, and that is 1.3 billion people. Now, if you have an idea what the conditions of life are in many parts of India where you have real poverty and not even infrastructure, roads in some parts of the country, it will be, in all likelihood, despite the excellent health system which India has, it probably will be much worse than in China. It is spreading very rapidly to Latin America, to Peru, to Brazil, to other countries, to Africa. And if you look at the situation in Europe, the north of Italy is out of control. In Lombardy, the army had to come to transport the corpses from Bergamo and other places because there were too many to be handled by the medical staff. Yesterday, the trade unions called for an 8-hour general strike because they insist that the government should impose stricter measures because of confusing messages. People were still running around trying to get to Sicily with cars and so forth. So this situation is one of really absolute disaster. If you look at Spain, where now the rate of infections is even greater than in Italy, you think you are in the 14th century, as you see on the pictures of Bruegel and Bosch and Holbein, where, for example, in Madrid, there were so many dead people that the army had to come to transport them and put them temporarily in a big ice rink because of the overload of death. Then there are 400,000 people in nursing homes where there is no protective gear, not enough personnel. The same situation is in Germany. I mean, Germany, the supposed rich industrial power, because of a lack of precaution and cuts for 20 years, the health officials, like from the emergency head or the head of the emergency department of the clinic in Wolfsburg, Mrs. Erdmann, she said that there is absolutely no protective gear for the medical personnel. Others say we have only a few days, and if it hits the medical personnel, that is the end. So then in Great Britain, finally, Boris Johnson, after pursuing for quite some time this completely irresponsible policy of the herd immunity, which is the idea that 60 or 70% of the population must get infected first, which naturally means many people will die. He reversed course and imposed a lockdown pretty much in the same way like Germany. Only 2 people can meet, and only important missions can be done out of the home. Naturally, in the United States, the situation is getting the worst epicenter now, according to the World Health Organization. New York is, and other places, but especially New York and Seattle, the West Coast, there are red alert areas. Governor Cuomo is doing a lot to do whatever is possible to increase the intensive care units in the hospitals, build more hospital beds. But it is an absolutely traumatic situation, because if you think that you have all these homeless, you have generally you have a complete lack of medical staff, you have a lack of medical equipment, and now the effects of the neoliberal cutbacks of the last decades is really coming home to roost, and we have an absolute traumatic situation, which is why we absolutely need to reflect on the changes. I mean, obviously we first have to do everything possible to stop it, and there I can only say the experience from China, from Wuhan and Hubei province, is you have to have testing as much as possible. You have to gear up the production as much as you can, because what happened, what functioned in Wuhan was that they just tested everybody several times. They isolated the infected people, they put them in quarantine, and that did work. So as a positive result, today the quarantine in Wuhan can be lifted. But these kinds of measures which were applied in China are not being applied everywhere in the West, and that lesson has to be learned very quickly.
Well, Helga, you've mentioned in terms of the health emergency, the importance of cooperation and solidarity between nations. And we see an enormous effort coming out of China and even Russia as well to provide personal protective equipment and so on. And yet we still hear the voices attacking China, blaming China. What's wrong with these people?
Well, as you say, China is making an unbelievable effort. They are now sending medical equipment to 82 countries around the world. They send their medical teams helping the African nations. They're sending teams to Italy, to Spain, to France, to Iran, to Iraq, to Venezuela, and actually every country which asks for help, they are responding to. Even in Germany, where the district administrator from Heinsberg was calling on President Xi Jinping for help. The General Council from Düsseldorf responded instantly on behalf of the Chinese ambassador in Berlin and just asked how much equipment was needed, and they would immediately cooperate. Now, this district administrator was in a German TV program, and the moderator asked quite angry, why did you do that? And this administrator just said, look, you have no idea. Heinsberg was the hotspot which was put under quarantine. It's a small city, but the entire population was under quarantine because of a high infection rate. He said, you have no idea what it means to have days and days to treat so many people and then have no equipment and so forth. So it was a complete act of desperation. And I have said that any nursing situation or any hospital where you have a lack of equipment, people should ask China, because China has done certain things right and the West has not. So let me just say this, that in an emergency like this, if you then have attacks on China and Russia and Cuba for that matter, I think these people are either insane, that they just don't have the moral fitness to survive, or they are criminal. And there are right now many think tanks and mainstream media who are still on this rampage. The think tank CSIS, the American Enterprise Institute, they had such statements blaming even the Belt and Road Initiative and the connectivity for this is just completely insane and just shows a very evil intention. A certain moderator of the second channel in the German TV yesterday went into a raving attack, commenting the fact that Wuhan is now ending the quarantine, and basically that they can also reactivate the economy, going into a really like rabies. I mean, this moderator should be tested if he has not rabies, because something is wrong with the way he thinks. If you look what China did, and that cannot be stressed enough, China alleviated 850 million people from poverty in the last decades. Because of that, it became the second strongest economy in the world. And if China would not have done that, it would not have been in the position to react to the outbreak of the pandemic the way it did, namely by immediately taking strict measures in Wuhan and Hubei province, by sending 42,000 medical staff from around the country, and the whole country went into solidarity supporting this most affected region. And that was successful. So now they can lift the quarantine, and naturally they geared up the whole production to produce test kits, masks, protective clothes, breathing devices. And they keep this now up, despite the fact that the crisis has somehow slowed down and has signs of hoping that it will be lessened inside China, so that they can supply the rest of the world. To attack that is, as I said, either insane, shows an insane mind, or a criminal intention. I think what China is doing, and Russia for that matter, who have sent large support to Italy and Cuba, which has sent many medical teams around the world, these countries should be praised. And this ideological indoctrination, which some people cannot get rid of, really has to be marked as a sign of senility or worse.
Well, one of the other signs of insanity are people who are saying no one could have predicted this, that's why we're not prepared. But it's clear there's a lack of personal protection equipment, lack of ventilators, lack of hospital beds. And the idea that no one could have known about this is completely false, is proven by what your late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has been warning about, going back to the 1971 break with the Bretton Woods system. And given the economic crisis that's a part of this emergency, I think it's really important for people to hear from you precisely what Lynn had said and tried to do to get us to prepare for this.
Yes, as you said, he warned that when Nixon took down the Bretton Woods system in 71, he warned that this would lead to the danger of a new depression, the danger of a new fascism, and pandemics. And then in 74, he instituted a biological Holocaust task force to study the effect of both the austerity policy following out of this Nixon measures, but also the result of the IMF and World Bank policy on the developing sector. Because if people remember, the IMF introduced the conditionality policy, which meant that developing countries first had to pay their debt before they could invest in the health sector or infrastructure. And this task force warned that this would lead to new pandemics. Now, we published in the meantime 6 comprehensive studies showing exactly what this economic Malthusian policy towards the developing sector would do, warning of pandemics, I mean, really throughout the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and nobody can say that we did not put out the warning that this would happen. Now then, in 2002, 2003, when the SARS epidemic happened, there were many studies and scenarios saying this can come back. And at that time, the latest, the governments should have gone into preparations for the outbreak of such pandemics, but the opposite was done. They increased the austerity, the cutback in the health sector. Many hospitals were taken down. The privatization changed the health sector to just go for profit instead of the protection of the health of the population. In 2012, in the German parliament, there was a study made warning exactly of such a pandemic of a coronavirus to come. And still, absolutely nothing was done. And we already talked last week about the scenario done by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the CIA, the World Economic Forum in October last year, exactly studying the outbreak of a coronavirus pandemic, and still nothing was done. And even when the pandemic broke out in China, end of last year into January, and the Chinese government reacted with the known measures, all they could do is to attack the authoritarian style of China, but they did not do anything. I mean, the fact is the German health minister Spahn in this period said he did not expect the virus to come to Germany. He kept saying in January into February that the German health system was well prepared. And this is all either utter incompetence or worse. So I think that it should be really noted that my husband, my late husband, and the organization associated with him, we are on this since 50 years. And a lot of the attacks on us came because of that, because we attacked Wall Street and the City of London and the casino economy as being responsible for this. And naturally, the powers to be, really felt that to be their Achilles heel. So they started an unprecedented attack of slanders and vilification against us. They put my husband innocently in jail, Bush Senior in particular. And I think, the fact that our warnings were not listened to really is now the reason why many people pay with their lives. And if there's any conclusion, then people must look at the analysis of my late husband and also the solutions he had proposed, and which are still the only solutions to remedy the situation in the future.
And Helga, I want to get to that in a moment when we take up the financial crisis, but I just want to bring it back to one other aspect of the solidarity and cooperation versus geopolitics. We have a call from the UN Secretary General for a world ceasefire. You've issued a call for an end to sanctions to countries that, like Iran, Venezuela, that are suffering from lack of equipment, lack of support. Just say something about that, because I think this is something that this geopolitics is actually war crimes.
Yes, sanctions are a war crime, because if you deprive entire countries from acquiring the medical supply to protect their population, this is a war crime. And I think there must be an absolute ruthless change in the thinking. I full-heartedly endorse what UN General Secretary Guterres is calling for: a ceasefire worldwide. All the drone attacks and skirmishes and whatnot has to stop, because only if mankind is putting all our forces together to solve this, that we have a chance to overcome this crisis. And I think that, the idea of President Xi Jinping, who already in 2017 at the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, which I attended, where he called for a health Silk Road, is also something, which absolutely must be put on the agenda instead, because we have to work together to build a decent health system in every single country around the world, what Xi Jinping calls the health Silk Road. Because if you don't do that, you cannot protect a country. You cannot stop a virus from coming through the border. The only protection is to go in the direction of building the economy in the southern hemisphere. Our proposal to develop the Silk Road into a world land bridge, connecting all the continents through infrastructure and creating the economic conditions for countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and parts of Europe and the United States to survive. That is the only remedy, and people have to really straighten up and become reasonable. And as the crisis will escalate, I think that will become clearer, and those who are still warmongers should be shut down and put in asylum, because they're really a danger and a menace to the whole human race. So I think this initiative of Guterres should really be discussed everywhere, and that should be the mindset to solve the problem.
Now, the other area where your husband has been proven right over and over and over, and you have absolute authority on, is the economy. We have to distinguish, I think, in the financial package between the emergency health aid that's needed and protection of people versus the use of the so-called big bazooka to carry out multi-trillion dollars worth of bailouts of hedge funds, shadow banking institutions, and others. You issued a call for a shutdown in trading. Why don't you tell us what you had in mind with that?
Well, as you say, it is absolutely legitimate if the governments are now providing liquidity to keep the firms going, to keep people having access to wages, to payments, to just maintain economic activity of the real economy. That is legitimate. But that is not the whole reason why the Federal Reserve, the EZB, are going into the direction of helicopter money. And in the case of the Federal Reserve, they already have announced 4 trillion liquidity creation, and they said there is no limit to that. Lagarde, the head of the ECB, has also said whatever it takes. Ursula von der Leyen said, every country can now pump, and she used the word pump as much money into their economy as they wish. The black zero is all of a sudden, no longer the holy cow it was. And if that would be only for the real economy, it would be fine. But a large part of that is to maintain the casino economy part of the whole problem. I think the former economist of the Landesbank Bremen, Volker Hellmeier, he put out in his newsletter the correct point that the over dimension of that is to protect the dynamic of the algorithms in the financial markets, which is a sort of one way of describing that. The derivative trade is occurring in the tech of nanoseconds around the globe. And to protect that speculative bubble, this is why they are opening the sluices of the financial system. And that will lead in the very short term to a hyperinflation like it happened in Germany in 1923. And if people remember that lesson, that was the expropriation of the entire population of their life earnings and life savings. And, that is now threatening not in one country, but, really in all the countries which are part of this system. And only those which are not entirely integrated in that have a chance to escape that under present conditions. So this is why I said that this is now the moment to close the markets, to stop this insane vacillations in the stock market, and use that pause of, a short period of time, whatever it takes, and then implement a Glass-Steagall reorganization. And we have talked about this many times. The reintroduction of Glass-Steagall, the banking separation introduced by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933, would mean that the state is protecting the commercial banks, keep them running, and make a firewall so that the investment banks are separated and have no longer access to the savings of the commercial banks, or the bailouts from the taxpayer money, but that they have to bring their books in order on their own. If they can't, they have to declare insolvency and disappear. Now, the reason why you need a certain pause is because it's complicated, because the many of the things belonging to the real economy and are legitimate, like the pension funds, are now heavily involved in the casino economy, because that has been the system as it developed. And you have to somehow protect those things which belong to the life earnings of people or their physical existence and the real economy. And that takes some sorting out. So some things you have to freeze, and it takes a while to figure it out. And then naturally there is a lack of liquidity, and that's why you have to have the immediate installation or reactivation of national banks. These national banks must give out credit lines directed for the real economy and investment in productive products, projects. And that has to be done in every country. Now, in most countries, you have the possibility, like in Germany, you can reactivate or just strengthen the role of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, the credit institute for reconstruction, which was used in the post-war period to finance the economic miracle in Germany, which was based on Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And similar approaches can be taken in every country. Now, then you need to have cooperation among all these national banks. You have to reintroduce a fixed exchange rate system. And then basically that becomes the new Bretton Woods system, a new credit system. And then naturally you have to reintroduce different criteria for what is a legitimate investment and what is not. And they are naturally those things which mean an increase in the productivity of the economy, such as crash programs for thermonuclear fusion, for optical biophysics, for life sciences in general, to combat the origins, or to find out what are the origins of these pandemics and how to overcome them, but also space medicine, space technology in general, international cooperation in space research and travel. These are the areas which absolutely need to be serviced by these credit lines in order to develop new economic platforms, because the devastation of this pandemic in the real economy is going to be very big. And you have to really think of when you combat it, which hopefully will happen sometimes, with new vaccines and so forth, but you will have a devastation after that, and you have to recreate the world economy on a higher level. So these are the principles which my husband called the 4 laws. And we are calling right now to implement all of this. And I ask all of you, our viewers and listeners, to help in a mobilization, because it is very clear that the governments who were caught by surprise by this pandemic, which they should have not been because there was ample warning, they are also not yet in the position to discuss the principles how to reorganize the economy. So I'm really calling on you, sign our petition to have this shutting down of the markets, to go for the 4 laws, and to have a summit of the most important countries, especially China, Russia, India, and the United States, and hopefully with the cooperation of some other countries, to implement such a top-down new world economic order, because nothing less will solve the problem.
Well, Helga, I think people will appreciate what you just went through in terms of an actual solution without panic, how to address what is an existential crisis. But you've also made the point repeatedly that this offers us an opportunity to change the way we think about ourselves and our fellow human beings. You've talked about the new paradigm. I think in the minutes we have remaining, it would be useful to give a sense of not just why that's necessary, but why it's possible.
Well, I think that the idea that geopolitics would be there forever is really a troglodyte idea, which only people like Ursula von der Leyen and such people seem to cling to. Geopolitics, the idea that one nation or a group of nations has the right to defend their interest against another group of nations with all means, if necessary, even military means. I mean, this is something which, in the age of thermonuclear weapons, pandemics, and just the fact that the whole world is hanging together so closely, is really an outdated idea, and it absolutely must be replaced by a new paradigm of cooperation, of defining the interest of the one humanity first. I think what we have to adopt as a philosophy is that there are common aims of mankind, such as the strategic defense of the earth. This is a program of my late husband, which he forwarded a couple of years ago, where he said, our planet is not only threatened by asteroids, comets, uh, and if one of these heavenly bodies would clash with the Earth, it could have a complete catastrophe for our species as a result. So that's something which no one nation can defend itself against, but we should cooperate. But in the same SDE approach, he also said that we have to defend against the outbreak of pandemics. And obviously, that is an urgent lesson to be learned, because a pandemic also cannot be solved by one country, but you need to eliminate the conditions which make pandemics possible, which requires both a study of what is life. Life is not yet well understood, because otherwise we could have solved sicknesses like cancer or virus. A virus is not something which is not part of life. I mean, there are many viruses which are part of the biosphere, but we don't understand exactly how they function and what is the process of life in general to as part of the universe. It's a principle of the universe which we have to absolutely work together. All the scientists of the world should exchange their knowledge. They should cooperate on it. So I think that the new paradigm must be a completely different relations among nations. Nations will be important probably for a very long time to come, because they are the expression of a joint history, a joint culture, a joint language, uh, poetry. You will not have a Esperanto and write poems. So nations will be important, but I think also uh, they will become less important as compared to the idea of the one humanity, if we are supposed to survive as a human species. And that is an idea which also was articulated by my late husband, actually late in his life, but he made it a big point. In the same way, he called for the abolition of the party system, in the tradition of George Washington, who said, watch out for the party system, because this is what causes the separation of people and follow their lobby interest, and we should not have these parties. And in the same way, nations should cooperate and not be pitched against each other. So I think the future of humanity must be defined from the standpoint of what kind of a future do we want to have in 50, in 100 years from now. Xi Jinping has called it the shared community, or the community of a shared future. And this pandemic makes very clear we have a shared future. We either survive all together, or maybe only a few of us, or none. So I think if we look at the present from the standpoint of where do we want the world to be in 100 years from now, we will have joint space exploration. We will have villages on the moon. we may have a city on Mars already. We will have a completely different idea of collaboration and rationality, working together, referring to the creativity of the other, being happy when the other one is developing instead of seeing it as a competition. And I'm quite confident that the human species is the only creative species, at least known in the universe so far, and that if we get through this crisis and really change our life and change the view we have about this whole question, that we can actually come out strengthened out of this crisis and start a new era of cooperation of all of humanity. But it does require a change in the thinking, and I'm inviting you to join us in this effort, and we need a lot of support. So contact us, sign our petition for the 4Power Summit, and work with us, because we need right now a mass mobilization to do the kinds of things which the politicians obviously have not been able to do, or very poorly. So join us.
Okay, Helga, thank you very much. And we'll see you next week, and we'll evaluate how things have moved in the course of the next days ahead. So thank you.
Stay healthy.
Okay.